Hello everyone, I'm Soledad Davis from PsicoCymática, and I have the privilege, I'm very happy to be here in person with Philip Graves, that in his library you can see many books and journals here in the back, but there are many more. Like there are like 3-4 rooms, 5 rooms actually.
3 rooms downstairs, which are actually my library, and then 2 upstairs, which are the Astrological Association's library.
So I would love to talk about your project, the library, but also you have inside the library your bookstore. So people also can know that he sells book, and to see his website, to see the list of the books he's selling. So tell me a little bit about the project, how you started with astrology and your interest in the history of astrology in particular.
Well, I started just as a student of astrology who was looking to understand the degree of influence it really had. So I started with sun sign books by Linda Goodman, which gave me interest in learning more deeply, and then began to use books that allowed me to calculate the positions of all the planets and interpret the planets and the houses and the signs and in aspect to each other and so on. And I took it further just by looking at recommended books in the backs of others and browsing the bookshops in Edinburgh and Scotland, where my mother lived at that time. And this was while I was still an undergraduate doing my BA in French at the University of Hull. And I just explored more and more sources. By the time I graduated at the age of 23 from my BA, I had about 60 books on astrology. So that was a good start, and I kind of paused it there as I tried to get myself established in the job market over the next few years, and do other things like music as well at that time. Then in 2001 I came online and got involved in an astrology community on the Microsoft network, MSN as it was called. And they had 2 services at that time. One was MSN Chat, and that was where I started. I got into a very lively chat room with a lot of regulars who were fun to discuss things with, and a lot of occasional visitors who just wanted to raise particular astrological topics. And that also led to my involvement in a group on MSN Groups, which another of the members, the users of the chat room, had started. And I contributed so much content to that he eventually appointed me as his joint manager in the summer of the following year, and I decided to develop it with articles on the elements of astrology and the different techniques, the different areas such as relationship astrology, predictive astrology, natal astrology, and so on. And that was a kind of part-time hobby of mine for several years then. In 2004, I moved out to Sweden. I then had less time for my active involvement in the online group, but by that time I had about 300 books, because I'd bought quite a lot more in order to contribute good quality articles to the website and so on, or to the online group, I should say. And I got a real interest by that time in the history of astrology, partly thanks to the reprints of older sources, and also to the new translations by people like Robert Hand and Robert Schmidt of the older sources. So I decided I wanted to take that further, so I just kept collecting even after I moved out to Sweden. And I think I mentioned to you earlier that by the time I left Sweden 12 years later, my collection had expanded from 300 books to about 6,000. So
and he had to move all that books
from Sweden to the UK. That was a big job.
Yeah.
It really was a big job.
And once you establish here, you start to develop and buying more and more books. And how many books do you have right now?
Right now I have in total around 10,000 edition volumes. I think is the best measure, because some books are technically multi-volume sets, and I also have a quite substantial range of periodicals which amount to around 14,000 individual issues. 14,000 individual issues of journals is not as much in terms of space as 10,000 books, but it's still a substantial
amount. Very substantial. And there is you have a specialty in the kind of book you want to have in your library, or?
I would say absolutely anything that is either a primary source or a secondary source on Western astrology. That accounts for the vast majority of books. I have made some space for Eastern astrological traditions too. I've tried to increase that in the last few years to make the library more inclusive of other traditions, even though I haven't studied those traditions myself. So that's why I now have a couple of bookcases full of Indian astrological books.
And also Chinese astrology.
A small number of more academic source books on Chinese astrology and divination too. That's right.
And do you have some favorite books?
Yes, I would say my favourites are probably some of the Renaissance Latin originals, which are the most expensive books in the library, because if you buy an original edition of a famous astrological text from the 16th or 17th centuries, it does tend to cost upwards of £1,000, sometimes several times that. So one of my favourites is the Speculum Astrologiae of Francesco Leontini, a great Italian astrologer who he was an early edition from the mid-1570s, which was already several hundred pages long, and then he expanded that and added some other miscellaneous writings of his to it, and made the definitive 2-volume edition, which runs to around 2,500 folio-sized pages. And you saw one of the volumes earlier. It's really vast, split between two volumes, and among the contents are a very detailed commentary, I think, on the 3rd and 4th books of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, which he provides together with the Greek text and the Latin text, which is extraordinary. You never really see that. You would sometimes see a commentary on its own, perhaps with parts of the source text, but not in 2 languages. So he was really dedicated, and I think when we looked at his picture earlier, I think we both agreed he looked a bit like a monk, and perhaps he was one. I can't honestly remember his biography without checking, but he's 2,500 pages of Latin text on astrology, and part of it is also a commentary on the De Sphæra of Sacrobosco, which was a very popular astronomical teaching textbook in the Middle Ages, and after that it remained very popular in the Renaissance. But most of it is astrological, and I think the dedication, the number of hours he must have put into writing all that text in Latin, it's just extraordinary to think. Actually, I could name 2 more. 2 we looked at earlier. One is Girolamo Cardano's commentary on the Tetrabiblos, which went through 3 editions in the 16th century and was then reprinted essentially as part of his Opera Omnia in the mid-17th century, which is more common in that form. But and we were discussing earlier how the first and second editions of 1554 and 1555 both contained a very controversial horoscope, speculative horoscope for Jesus Christ, and that attracted the attention of the Roman Inquisition later in the 16th century, and almost certainly contributed to Cardano's arrest and imprisonment when he was already quite an old man. He was released, but in return for a kind of effective plea bargain, whereby he had to renounce making any kinds of prophecy in the future and also give up teaching. So it must have been an awful fate for somebody who not only wrote on astrology, but he wrote on so many different subjects. I mean, his collected Opera Omnia, his collected works, is a 10-volume set. The amount he wrote on all sorts of subjects is just incredible. And can you imagine being sentenced no longer to be allowed to teach when you have such an active mind? It must have been a fate worse than death almost for him in the last few years of his life, but he left a huge legacy. And then eventually, the edition we were looking at is the folio of 1578, which I think was just after he died. I think he probably lived to around 1576. And in Switzerland, in Basel, a new edition was published of his commentary on the Tetrabiblos, together with another commentary on it, a shorter one by a Swiss professor called Konrad Dazipodi. And Dazipodi, or whoever else edited this edition, made a very sensible decision to excise the horoscope of Christ from the relevant part of the volume, so that there was less likely to be trouble from censorship. And I think perhaps publishing it in Switzerland, a little bit of arm's length from Italy, was also wise.
Yeah, totally, yes.
I have to say, books printed before 1600 are very expensive, so I have just, at times I had the means to, I have just bought a small number of the kind of classic source texts from the mid to late 16th century, so Garrico, Garceus, or Garceus, his real name, Magini, Cardano, Giantini, and Ransau, for instance. Those are some of the 16th century texts, but there were far more 16th century astrological texts than I could ever possibly afford.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the Renaissance already was a period on the history of astrology, where a lot of debate, that about, you mentioned this, the prophecy of with the chart of Jesus, or different kind of prophecy around theological reformation as well, and a lot of criticism and apologetic also debates and discourses on astrology. So it's a very rich period about astrology that somehow is like it continues till today. And we were talking earlier that you, as an expert in the history of astrology, and also with all your books here, you can see like a continuation a continuity in the history, and it's not that, for example, nowadays that we have these traditional modern debates, it's not something that was cut and suddenly modern astrology arrived. That is much more complex, and also you can see a continuity and a pattern during the history, and that actually it was not lost, that kind of traditional notions and techniques. You can find those kind of contents in the 18th, 19th, and also 20th century.
We were looking, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
We were looking earlier as a good example of an early 20th century book that was written in a very traditional style by J.A. Houghton, The Handbook of Astrology, which is quite a rare book, self-published in the United States around 1910. And for each of the delineations, he gives separate readings depending on whether the planet is well dignified or ill dignified, which is very much a traditional concept and something you don't expect to see in the modern kind of cookie cutter 20th century delineations. That's a good example of how traditional astrological methods actually survive far later than a lot of traditional astrologers themselves acknowledge. There's a kind of tendency for traditional astrologers to arbitrarily end their interest around 1700, because so many great astrologers of the Renaissance and the early modern period did have their texts published prior to 1700. But in fact, a lot of the methods they taught remained in active use for a long time after that.
I think that is very important, because one of the explanation of the arguments for traditional astrology is the astrology from the Hellenistic period to the Renaissance, and from that onwards is something else. So historically is wrong. So it's important to go back and reread the history, because sometimes I see it as a reductionist way of seeing the history. And also during those centuries was much more complex and different kind of astrology were happening as well.
That's very true, and a good example of that, which we were discussing this morning, I think, was around the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the fact that there coexisted more traditionally oriented astrologers such as Alfred Pierce, whose works we were looking at. We were looking at the first edition in 2 volumes of his textbook of astrology and then the Science of the Stars, and others of his persuasion who very much were still using the traditional techniques based on older sources. But then there was also, at that time, a new breed of astrologers. Their whole focus was more on the soul, and they perhaps weren't motivated to give quite such involved, precise mathematical calculations to arrive at their delineations, and so it was really technically a simplified form of astrology that was introduced by people like Hiram Butler, the author of Solar Biology in 1887, and he in turn influenced countless others, including Alan Leo in England, to adopt a similar, slightly simplified form of astrology. Although, having said that, Leo's astrology is a lot more complex than Butler's. Butler's was really heavily simplified, and Butler didn't even recognise that what he was writing on was astrology. He gave it a new name, solar biology, and he emphasised the importance of the sun and the moon and the 144 sun and moon sign combinations, which is something that others such as Alan Leo and Grant Louis have copied, but Alan Leo's actual delineations were much more traditional in many respects. I've got examples of a couple of examples of in-depth readings that he gave to clients as typescripts in the library, so you can actually see what he did, and it was certainly in some ways more traditional than you would imagine, given Leo's reputation among modern historians.
True. And recently you were telling about the rising of pop astrology.
One of the things that we were discussing was the fact that actually there have been popular forms of astrology going back at least, in fact, before the early days of print, but there's evidence for it in the printed era, going back to very early days.
But it's much earlier.
Yes, with almanacs, and some of them were of quite a simplified nature. And but what they all had in common was that they were designed to appeal to the ordinary person in the street who wanted some practical advice on what to expect in the year
during
ahead.
The year ahead,
which is not dissimilar in spirit to the kinds of advice that sun sign columnists have given since the 1930s, when the 12-paragraph sun sign column became a common feature of magazines and newspapers. And we were also talking about how the rise of popular astrology in the early 20th century almost went hand in glove with the revival and proliferation of interest in serious astrology. It's almost as though it was actually the developing interest in serious astrology that facilitated more of a reach to mass markets, because there was so much interest in astrology that a lot of people in different media all realised that they could appeal to their readership by covering the subject in some way. Now, obviously, if you're talking about the mass media, they are out to sell newspapers or magazines to the masses, so anything very, very complex in terms of astrological technique doesn't work, because 98% of their readers won't understand or won't have the patience to follow. And so that's probably why you start getting around 1910 in the USA, all over America, all over the USA, you start getting these columns called the Daily Horoscope, which at that time were not sun sign columns. They were general astrological forecast for everyone based on the current transiting planets and how they looked, what we would call the astrological weather today. And that gradually was refined into the sun sign forecasts from the 30s.
Yeah, and from your perspective and your expertise on the history of astrology, what do you see astrology now?
How do I see it now, or
Yeah.
how do I see how do I anticipate it changing? What are you thinking, really?
Yeah, a little bit of both.
Okay.
Yeah, like from our present, how do you see that we are going?
I think we're at a time where there is almost unprecedentedly ready access to astrological source texts, partly because since the internet was launched, it's become far more easier to find, buy and learn about second-hand as well as new books on astrology or any other subjects. I think that has partly facilitated people's specialisation in areas of astrology that are particularly interesting to them. But really, this has been going to some extent even before the internet, that astrology has been fractured into different specialisations, but it may even be heightened now. And these include traditional astrology, which itself is subdivided into Hellenistic, medieval and Renaissance forms of traditional astrology. And then within modern astrology, there are so many different varieties as well, from the kinds of nuts and bolts, sort of semi-traditional modern astrology of the 20th century, to the psychological astrology that leans on the ideas of Jung, to the kind of the branches of astrological thinking that depend on a belief in reincarnation, and in their broadest sense they're called karmic astrology, but increasingly the term evolutionary astrology has been used to describe them, although originally evolutionary astrology was just a very specific subset of karmic astrology. And I would just say that the number of specific schools has increased since then. There are just more varieties of modern astrology now, and there are of course also the dedicated traditional astrologers who practice very specific forms of traditional astrology, access to the knowledge of which is probably a lot easier now than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
I would love to make many questions to you, because it's a pleasure to also to hear or everything you know about the history of astrology. Is really a pleasure. But I would love if you can tell also to the audience what is the kind of work that you are doing with the library?
The library is really an open-ended project. At the moment, most of the time, it's my personal research base, because I do a lot of articles on the history of astrology for magazines, and I also have recently started teaching the history of astrology for a school, the Morris School. And so that's my part of my personal angle, but I do also welcome visitors with advance notice, preferably at least a few weeks advance notice, because I have to fit visitors into my schedule and take time out of my paid work to accommodate visitors. I also have started a little second-hand bookshop that you mentioned earlier, which specialises in out-of-print editions. So I tend to specialise in the rarer editions, such as, they do include a lot of modern books, but books that have gone out of print, or in some cases the original editions of books that are still in print, but the original editions are desirable to collectors.
Philip, thank you for receiving me in paradise. You will see. You will see, and all the best. And thank you for all the work you are doing here. Really, not only here. I think that you are disseminating very important information for the astrological community, and I think that is very important also for your research, and the work you do I think that's very important. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Bye.
This area from here to about the end of this row are all books that were printed, I think, before around 1730, and then this row down here and a few of these others are books that were printed between the late 18th century and the late 19th century, so the ones which are after these but before the ones in this area.
Yeah, I can see good pepper here. And Christian astrology, this is what, which edition?
That's the second edition. Edition 1659.
Yeah.
And the first is here.
And this is the first edition of Lilly's book.
In quite an early binding that used originally had two clasps,
look at
but there's
that.
just one left, and it's very fragile.
It's like the secret book, so you need the code to open the book.
You can see an early owner has added a chart of. So that's the portrait of Lily and the title page, which is into 26 books. There's just one volume.
It's just at the beginning it was a single volume.
Right. But if you look at the actual text, you can see how they managed to fit all 26 books in. This is just the introduction, but when we get to the main, which is in quite large text, when we get to the main text, this is the life of Morin. This is all the introductions still.
Still introduction.
Marini Vita. So the Countess' life. When we get to this is still the introduction.
The apologética, claro.
And then
Again,
finally,
needs to explain
the
with.
main text that has.
Oh, very small letter. That we need 26 volume. Yeah, primer.
And later it goes to two columns, so the amount on this page, each page is huge. The amount of material on each page. And so only the Liber Secundus.
Yeah. And so this is the first edition.
I think there was only one edition, and
Only one.
of the Latin version.
Only the second.
And then there was nothing more until the translations started to appear in the 20th century.
Hello. Yeah, it's more philosophical, the creation, the universe.
So we're continuing the alphabetical ordering of all these books from 1875 to 1960. So we're carrying on with the rest of Vivian Robson's works here, and we carry on with these last few rows, and eventually we get to C.C. Zane, who's probably the last of the authors in this section. It's from 1880s, I think. academic works on Babylonian and Mesopotamian astrology. And you gradually move forward, it then moves more onto ancient Greek and Roman astrology from somewhere around there. This is also Mesopotamian Babylonian. Then it moves into medieval. Then it carries on down here, so we're still in medieval material at the moment, and we're gradually moving into the Renaissance eventually. And that carries on here and concludes along there, around there. So that's kind of miscellaneous, more studies either of the early modern period or specific topics which didn't really belong elsewhere.
Right.
And the whole middle aisle of this room is German books, and there are also bits of this area are German. I think that's pretty much it. It's all German books, some of which are, most of which are just general astrology books, but there are some history books among the German section too, such as these ones, which are academic history books in German.
So this is all German or just this?
Everything, both sides is in German.
What? This a lot.
And the top
Let's
there
check.
as well, yeah. There's a huge German astrology literature. So
Yes.
lots of these are early 20th century German almanacs. They sometimes call them calendars in German. And this is a bit later, mid 20th century cosmobiology.
Biology, yeah, that is very important in German.